It's wonderful to see everyone here this morning. It's truly a blessing for us to be able to be together as the Lord's family in this place. And we enjoy being able to be together. We enjoy doing things together. One of the things that many of us enjoy doing with our families as we have opportunities to travel is just spend some time looking at various memorial type things that are around the country. One of the things that seems to be of the most interest in many cases would be a Hall of Fame. And we have hundreds of Halls of Fame around the country. And if you're going to make you could also make a career of just going around and looking at these Halls of Fame. I mean, like here in Texas, we've got about 25, and there are even 2 Halls of Fame in Waco that we could go to. And we really have a lot of fun as we go to these places. But what was the purpose of even creating a Hall of Fame? Well, generally what we're doing is we are wanting to honor a group of people for whatever reason. And the Halls of Fame that we have, we want to be sure and think about the members that are in that Hall of Fame and try to remember the things that they have done. These Halls of Fame usually will have a lot of information to help us look at those individuals and think about them and potentially even learn from their life different characteristics that would be good for us to include in our own lives. A lot of times, though, when we go to these, the first thing that we're doing whenever we walk in the door, we're just thinking about the entertainment that we're going to receive. Just being able to be there, seeing all the different artifacts and everything like that. It is a true privilege for us to have these places available. Now, the word fame is also found about 24 times in the Bible. There are 16 times in 11 different books of the Old Testament, and it's found about 8 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it's not found in any of the other books of the New Testament, or other than the 11 books of the Old Testament. It's not found in very many of the books there. We often talk a lot of time about Hebrews chapter 11. And when we do talk about it, a lot of times we'll describe it as the Hall of Fame of the faithful. And as we go through and we read the names, many of the names that we read are ones that have done something significant, and we think about a lot of the Bible stories that we've been taught. But we really, really don't know those people that are part of that Hall of Fame. Now, there are 16 that are mentioned by name in Hebrews 11. There are others that are just kind of lumped together in groups, but those groups are significant as well. As an example, when we think about the Israelites, as they're mentioned in verse 29 of Hebrews 11, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. The Israelites were important because they were doing what God had instructed them to do. And we think about, normally we think about a lot of the things that women incur as they are going around with just day-to-day life. And normally the burden of sadness is very frequently on women. But in verse 35, it says that the women received back their dead by resurrection. Because of their faithfulness, they were able to have this burden of sorrow lifted from their shoulders. And then if you go on and continue on in verse 35, it says, and others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Just reading some of the things here, and we have those last couple of verses, so much anxiety and persecution for those who are choosing to follow God. But the important thing is, because they were following God, the writer of the Hebrew letter does include men of whom the world was not worthy. Wonderful men, powerful men, men who have experienced so many painful things, and yet they remained faithful. They were qualified to be listed in what we call the Hall of Fame of the faithful. Many of them not by name because there were too many that were there to be mentioned. And the writer even says that he doesn't have the time to list all of the ones that were truly important. But the writer also does go on to say that these people are important to us, to the readers. All of these that have been mentioned, they are to be examples for the early church, who were the first readers of the Hebrew letter, but they are also important for you and me today. The most important description, I guess, is found in the second verse, where it says, speaking of faith, it says that, for by it the men of old gained approval. These people are important for us because they are to be examples for us. These people did things to honor and serve God. And even though the writer does not specifically state it, when he said that these were men who gained approval, it was God's approval that they were striving for. And it was God's approval that they received. So just a quick, easy example for us then is, if you want God's approval, look at what these examples have done and follow them. Follow their examples of being obedient to God. It's important for us to understand what these men have done. They are the witnesses that are being described in the first verse of the 12th chapter of Hebrews, where the writer says, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The writer is including you and me as part of what he's saying here. we need to understand that just as those men gained approval by being obedient to God, we are able to gain approval that same way. Now in verse 39, it tells us that they did not receive what was promised during their lifetimes. They were waiting for something that had been promised that was coming. But it hadn't happened yet. Now, we know that many of these, by prophecy, had been told of the forecoming of the Messiah. And so that's what they were waiting for. They were waiting for the Christ. And we know that in their cases, it was all in the future. But the difference for us is the Christ has come. And his instructions for us have come. We're not waiting for some key event to happen. It's already happened. Christ has been here. Now, as we think about all of these men and the examples that they are for us, do we really know them as well as we should? I mean, we have so many distractions. We've got television, we've got sports, you can name all kinds of things. We come in from work and we say, oh, I'm just too tired, I'm worn out. I hadn't got the energy to study to better understand these men. When we are thinking of just no energy or something like that, in a sense we could use a word that is used in the King James quite frequently, and the word is slothful. New American Standard uses the word lazy. And even in just the book of Proverbs, there are 11 different warnings about being slothful or lazy. Here are some examples from Proverbs. First, Proverbs 15, verse 19. The way of the lazy is a hedge of thorns, but the path of the upright is a highway. In Proverbs 18, verse 9, he also who is slack in his work is a brother to him who destroys. That's an interesting one to think about. If we are not building, as an example, let's say we're building a house, or if we're not building the house diligently and carefully, if we're building that house slothfully or lazily, we're only putting in 2 nails where you need 5, 1 nail where you need 3. And what's going to happen? That house isn't going to stand. You have a little storm come through, a little bit of wind, and the house is going to collapse. What's the difference between building a house slothfully or being the individual who comes along and just destroys things? Oh, here's another good example of what many of us would be like if we had this slothful or lazy attitude. Proverbs 19, verse 24. The lazy man buries his hand in the food bowl, but will not even bring it back to his mouth. I've got a handful of food here. I'm doing great. I'm doing wonderful, but it's not doing me any good because I don't ingest it. That's somebody that is really very lazy. And in Proverbs 21, verses 25 and the first part of 26 says, "The desire of the sluggard puts him to death, for his hands refuse to work. All day long he is starving." Now let's take that one and tie it back to the one in chapter 19. The sluggard, it's putting him to death, the lazy man, because he has a handful of food, but he can't even get it to his mouth to eat it. So what good is that food doing him? It's just putting him to death because he has no drive to get it to his mouth. And so all day long, he is starving. Also, Proverbs 24, verses 30 and 31. "I passed by the field of the sluggard, and the vineyard of the man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles, its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down." The sluggard, the lazy person, you're never going to see their property at its nicest. They just haven't got the energy to keep it up. They're allowing things to happen to it and they just let it go along. Now the question becomes, is this the way that we are working for Christ? He teaches against laziness in the parable of the talents. Now the key part of this is found in Matthew the 25th chapter, verses 24 through 28. "And the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours.' But the master answered and said to him, 'You wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gathered where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my own with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. It didn't require much energy for that individual, once they had been given that talent, to go down to the bank and deposit it so that it would be earning interest. It may not have taken as much effort as what the day-to-day labors of that individual were supposed to be. But he didn't have the energy. He would not take the time to go do just that simple thing. Looking back again at Hebrews, the Hebrew writer also does not forget laziness. In Hebrews, the 6th chapter, verses 9 through 12, the writer says, "But beloved, we are convinced of better things for you, and things that accompany salvation, though we are speaking in this way. For God is not unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." There is a reward out there for us. And in many respects, the amount of labor that it requires of us is not much. But it requires our obedience, and it requires our faith in God, in Christ, and that we're going to be serving them. Now, we do need to come to a better understanding of the members that we read about in the Hall of Fame of the Faithful. Why? They are to be remembered and honored for the things that happened in their lives. But they are also the examples that we need to understand and obey and follow. Now, I'm going to attempt to have some additional lessons in the future about additional members of the Hall of Fame of Faithful, so that we can actually come to a little bit better understanding. But what about us? Have we done things that would really allow us to be included in some kind of a Hall of Fame? Have we conducted ourselves the way that others would be honored to look at our lives, our history, and follow our example? I guess you can say that there is one additional Hall of Fame that is being created every day. And it's one that includes information on those that have been faithful to the Lord and to the Father. In Revelation, we have described there the names that are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. I guess another way of describing that book would be a Hall of Fame of Faithful. And our inclusion there is the one that really makes the most difference. Is your name going to be there? Or is it there already? We've got to work at it and make sure that we are serving God as we know we should, so that we can be included in the best Hall of Fame that you could ever find any place, because it's a home in heaven. This morning, if you realize that you are not part of that special Hall of Fame, the Book of Life, and you need to make a change to your life so that you will be added, or if you have been conducting yourselves in a way that you risk having your name blotted out of that Book of Life, and you need to turn around and start serving God as you know you should. But you realize that you need help. We're here. We're a team. We're all working together. And if you realize that you need help, who else would you want to turn to but our team leader and our team members? If there's anything we can do to help you, we encourage you to let us know as we sing our song of encouragement this morning.